August 1977, Graceland, Memphis. As the world mourned Elvis Presley's death, one woman stayed silent. His private nurse, the last person to see him alive. Decades later, she finally told what she saw. And what she revealed changed everything we thought we knew about the King's final hours. June 26, 1977, Market Square Arena, Indianapolis. 18,000 fans filled the seats, their cheers echoing off the steel rafters. The lights flared gold, the orchestra swelled, and the stage trembled as the King walked out for what no one knew would be his last show. Backstage, his private nurse, Marion Foster, adjusted the medication pouch in her pocket. She had joined the tour months earlier after being hired through Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. Her job was simple: keep him steady, keep him standing. But that night, she saw something she'd never seen before. He was smiling, the famous smile that could melt a city, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The mic crackled. The crowd roared. "Elvis Presley!" shouted the announcer. He stepped forward, nodded to the band, and began CC Rider. His voice filled the arena, deep and thunderous, but Marion caught a strain in it, a break where strength should have been. She glanced toward Joe Esposito, the road manager. He just shook his head, as if to say, "Let him finish." When the song ended, Elvis turned, wiped his brow, and whispered to Marion, "I'm fine, honey, just the lights." But his face said otherwise. The next number started. He moved slower, pausing between verses. The brass section covered for him. Sweat soaked through the collar of his white jumpsuit, sparkling with rhinestones that reflected 1,000 flashes from the crowd. Marion wrote later in her journal that the noise was deafening, but she could still hear his breath, shallow and uneven, through the monitors. By the fourth song, she noticed him glance to the side curtain, where she stood. For a moment, his eyes met hers, almost pleading. Then he smiled again and lifted his arms toward the fans. They screamed louder. They thought it was joy. She knew it was exhaustion. When Can't Help Falling in Love began, something shifted. The orchestra softened. The audience, thousands strong, swayed their lights like a sea of tiny stars. Elvis closed his eyes on the first line, voice trembling but pure. Marion felt her throat tighten. It didn't sound like a performance anymore. It sounded like goodbye. Halfway through, his voice cracked completely. The crowd gasped, then cheered even louder, thinking it was emotion. He smiled weakly and whispered into the mic, Thank you very much." The final chord rang out. He bowed, holding the mic stand like it was keeping him upright. 5 full minutes of applause thundered through the arena. Backstage, he nearly collapsed into Marion's arms. She steadied him, pressing a cold cloth to his neck. His pulse raced. "You should rest," she told him. He looked at her, eyes glassy, and said quietly, "We'll rest when it's over." Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked for a notepad and pen. He sat at the vanity, lights glaring off the mirror, and began to write something small on hotel stationery. She pretended not to look, but she saw him fold the page carefully, slip it into a leather pouch, and hand it to Joe Esposito. "Keep this with my things," he said. "Don't lose it." Marion never learned what was written that night. Not then. But she remembered the way he looked as he handed it over, like a man finishing a sentence he'd been writing his whole life. Later, as the crew packed up, Elvis placed a hand on Marion's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for not asking questions." She smiled faintly. "You'd tell me when you're ready." He nodded once. "Soon." Those were the last words he ever spoke to her on tour. Outside, fans screamed his name as the limousine pulled away from the arena. Inside, the King leaned his head against the window, eyes half closed. The city lights flickered across his face like slow-moving stars. Marion watched the car disappear into the night and felt a chill crawl down her spine. She didn't know why, but she whispered to herself, "That wasn't just a concert. It wasn't. It was a farewell disguised as applause. Would you have seen it if you'd been there?" When the tour ended, Elvis went home to Memphis and Marion went with him. She was officially on staff now, the night nurse, though she did far more than watch over his medicine. Her job was to guard what the world wasn't meant to see. The pain, the sleepless nights, the loneliness that followed fame. Graceland in 1976 was not the palace fans imagined. Yes, it glittered. Chandeliers, velvet curtains, gold records on the walls. But the house felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Every night, laughter drifted from the TV room. But by dawn, the silence was unbearable. Marian remembered her first week clearly. The smell of coffee mixed with cologne, the echo of boots in the hall. Elvis was polite, charming even, but tired. The kind of tired that medicine couldn't touch. "Marian," he'd said one evening, "you ever get so famous you forget who you started as?" She smiled, not sure how to answer. He didn't wait for one. Her nightly routine became sacred. Bring the pills, check the vitals, listen to him talk until sunrise. He'd strum his guitar between sentences, humming gospel songs that reminded him of Tupelo. Sometimes he'd laugh at his own stories. Sometimes he'd stop mid-sentence, lost in thought. On one of those nights, the conversation turned serious. He stared at a photo of Priscilla and Lisa Marie, resting on the piano. "People love Elvis," he said softly. "But they don't know me." "Not really." Marian asked what he meant. He chuckled. "They see the stage, the jumpsuit, the lights. But the man? The man's still looking for peace." Those words stayed with her. The next morning, she found him asleep on the couch, the TV still playing an old gospel special. In his hand was a crumpled note. She tried not to read it, but one line caught her eye before she looked away. "Forgive me for what I can't change." From that day on, Marian stopped seeing him as a patient and started seeing him as a man trying to heal himself. She kept his confidence. She never repeated his words, never told the tabloids who called weekly asking for just one detail. But each week the pressure grew. The fans outside the gates multiplied. They shouted his name day and night, desperate for a glimpse. Inside he moved slower. He laughed less. One evening in early August 1977, she found him in the kitchen at 3 a.m., barefoot, humming an old hymn. The rain outside tapped against the window like a heartbeat. She asked if he wanted his medication. He shook his head. "I just want a few quiet minutes." He looked toward the staircase and said, almost to himself, "Peace ain't in a pill, Marian. Peace is something you've got to earn." She didn't know what to say, so she just listened. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. A few nights later, he handed her a small key. "Keep this safe," he said. "You'll know when to use it." She frowned. "What's it for?" He smiled, tired but gentle. "When the time's right, you'll understand." She slipped the key into her pocket, not realizing what it unlocked. By now, the rest of the household noticed his changes too. Less food, more prayer, long walks around the garden before dawn. Joe Esposito told her privately, "He's talking about leaving the stage. Says he wants to start over somewhere quiet." But Marian could see the war inside him. He loved his fans, but the spotlight had become a cage. And the key he gave her, it began to feel like the weight of that cage itself. The night before his final performance, she walked past his room and heard him whisper, "I'm not ready to leave, but maybe it's not my choice." Those words chilled her, because people who talk like that aren't talking about concerts. They're talking about life. She made a silent promise then, to stay by his side no matter what happened next. But promises have a way of being tested. She didn't know that in just a few days. She'd be holding that key in her trembling hand and deciding whether to open the one thing he left behind. Would you have turned the key? August 15th, 1977, Graceland, Memphis. The air was thick and restless, heavy with the smell of rain. Thunder rolled over the Mississippi River like slow drums. Inside the mansion, most of the staff had gone home. Only the housekeeper, Joe Esposito, and Marian remained awake. Elvis couldn't sleep. He paced from room to room, robe trailing behind him, muttering half-songs under his breath. The grandfather clock struck 11, each chime echoing through the halls like a countdown. Marian found him in the den, sitting at the piano. His fingers brushed the keys gently, playing a line from an old gospel tune. The lamp beside him flickered. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the hollow under his eyes. "You should rest," she said softly. He didn't look up. "Can't. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the crowd. I keep thinking I've forgotten something important." He paused, pressing a single key until it rang. "You ever feel like you're running out of time, Marion?" She didn't answer. He smiled faintly. "That's what I thought." Outside, lightning flashed across the windows, turning his reflection into a ghostly blur. He stood, walked to a nearby shelf, and took out a small black box, one she'd never seen before. It was smooth, no markings, just a silver lock on the front. He placed it on the table between them. "If I don't wake up tomorrow," he said quietly, "this will explain everything." Marion froze. "Elvis, please don't talk like that." He held up a hand. "No, listen. I've made peace with some things. Others, not yet. But there's something in here that might help people see me. Not the showman, not the sinner, just the man." He handed her a small key, the same one he'd given her days earlier. "Keep it safe. Don't open it until you have to." Her pulse raced. "What's inside?" He smiled, tired and kind. "Truth." Then he turned back to the piano and started playing again. Softly, beautifully. The storm outside rose with him, lightning illuminating his silhouette like he was back under stage lights. At exactly midnight, Joe walked in, yawning. "You still up, boss?" "Couldn't sleep," Elvis said. "Figured I'd sing one more before I go." "Go where?" Joe chuckled. Elvis didn't answer. He played a few bars of unchained melody, his voice low but sure. Marion stood in the doorway, listening, trying to memorize the sound, because something in her gut told her this was the last time she'd ever hear it. When the song ended, he laughed softly. "Guess that's enough for one lifetime." He turned to Marion and said, "If anyone asks tomorrow, tell them I was fine. Tell them I was smiling." She nodded, her throat tight. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slipped it into the black box before locking it. Then he patted the top once, like a man closing a chapter. The house went quiet. The only sound was the rain tapping against the windows. Marion stayed by the door until he finally went upstairs. He paused halfway up the staircase, looked back, and whispered, "Thank you for keeping me human." Then he disappeared into the darkness. The clock struck 1. Marion sat in the living room, the locked box on her lap. Her fingers trembled around the key. She could still hear his voice echoing. "If I don't wake up tomorrow." A gust of wind blew through the open window, scattering sheet music across the floor. Pages fluttered like doves, lyrics sliding under the piano legs, pieces of songs unfinished. She gathered them, heart pounding. One sheet stopped her cold. It wasn't a song at all. It was a note written in his hand. "Peace begins when the music stops." She stared at it, unsure what to feel. Dread, sadness, or something deeper. Outside, thunder cracked again, closer this time. The clock read 2:30 a.m. Marion went upstairs to check on him one last time. His door was half open, the TV flickering softly. He was lying in bed, breathing slow, calm. On the nightstand, a Bible, a glass of water, and a photograph of Lisa Marie. She whispered, "Good night, Mr. Presley." He didn't stir. She turned off the hall light and closed the door. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. August 16th, 1977. The sun hadn't yet risen over Memphis. The air outside Graceland was still. Inside, everything was quiet. Too quiet. At 6 a.m., Marion woke to the faint sound of the TV in the next room. Elvis always slept with it on, a habit that made the house feel less empty. She smiled faintly, thinking he'd managed to rest at last. But when she passed his door an hour later, something felt wrong. The TV was still on, but the room behind it was silent. She knocked. No answer. "Mr. Presley?" she called softly. Still nothing. She hesitated, then pushed the door open. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a slice of pale morning light. The air smelled faintly of cologne and medicine. Elvis lay on the floor near the bathroom, face down, one arm outstretched as if reaching for something. The Bible from his nightstand had fallen beside him, open to the book of Psalms. For a few seconds she froze. Then instinct took over. She checked for a pulse, nothing. Her hands shook as she called out for Joe Esposito, her voice cracking. "Joe! Come quick!" Footsteps thundered down the hallway. Joe rushed in, his face turning white. "Call an ambulance," he said, kneeling beside Elvis. "Now!" Marion ran to the phone, heart hammering. The words barely came out. "It's Elvis Presley. He's not breathing." Within minutes, sirens wailed through the Memphis dawn. Paramedics flooded the hall. Flashing red lights painted the walls of Graceland as chaos swallowed the silence. Outside, neighbors began gathering at the gates. Someone turned on the radio, and within minutes, the news spread. Fans woke up to headlines that didn't feel real. Elvis Presley found unresponsive at Graceland. Marion stood back as medics worked, her eyes locked on the small black box still sitting on the table downstairs, the one he'd given her just hours before. She whispered to herself, "You said tomorrow. You said I'd know when." But she didn't feel ready to know. At 3:30 p.m., the official announcement came. Elvis Aaron Presley was gone. The world stopped. By sunset, thousands lined the streets. People wept openly, holding radios to their ears as gospel songs filled the airwaves. Across America, restaurants went silent. DJs couldn't finish their sentences. A legend had ended, but inside Graceland, a smaller, quieter story was just beginning. When the crowd outside grew too loud, Marion retreated into the study. She closed the door and sat down with the box. The same silver lock stared back at her. The key burned cold in her palm. She remembered his words. "If I don't wake up, this will explain everything." Her heart pounded. She didn't know whether opening it would bring peace or pain. The house creaked. Reporters shouted at the gates. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot clanged as staff cleaned in stunned silence. She turned the key. Click. Inside the box, everything was arranged with care. A folded piece of lined paper, a cassette tape labeled August 15th, and a small page torn from a Bible. Her breath caught. The Bible verse read, "And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, shall guard your hearts." She unfolded the letter next. His handwriting filled the page. Neat, deliberate. "To whoever finds this, maybe Marion, maybe Joe, tell the world I wasn't afraid. I just got tired of pretending. The man they cheered for was only part of me. The rest just wanted quiet." Her eyes filled with tears. "If I don't wake up, let them know I found peace, not fame. Don't let them turn this into another story about pills or pain. Let them know I prayed last night. I wasn't alone." The words blurred as tears fell onto the paper. She reached for the cassette tape and placed it in his small bedside player. The machine clicked. Then a hiss of static and his voice, faint but unmistakable. He was humming a gospel tune, soft and slow. Then his voice, tired but calm. "Lord, if this is it, let me go gentle. I've sung enough songs. I just want peace." The recording ended with silence, just the faint hum of air through the mic. Marion pressed stop. The room felt colder now. Outside, the first flowers were being laid at the gates. Fans prayed, cried, sang. None of them knew that upstairs, his final words had already been heard by the one woman he trusted most. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the box, and locked it again. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Hours later, as night fell and the world lit candles for the man they called a king, Marion stood on the Graceland balcony. She looked out over the crowd, thousands of lights flickering like stars. She whispered into the wind, "He found peace." He really did. The tape, the letter, the verse, they weren't evidence. They were confession. And she made a promise that night. She would never reveal them. Not until the world was ready to understand the man behind the music. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Not even in Graceland. 2 days after the funeral, Graceland was drowning in flowers. Over 80,000 fans had visited the gates. The scent of roses and candle wax hung heavy in the summer air. Reporters camped outside around the clock, shouting questions that no one inside wanted to answer. Marion stayed mostly upstairs, trying to disappear among the silence. Elvis's room had been sealed off after the investigators left. But downstairs on the study desk, the black box still waited, locked again, the tape and letter hidden inside. She thought about destroying them. She almost did. But every time she tried, she'd hear his voice from the recording, soft, calm, human. It wasn't the king. It was Elvis, the man who wanted peace. Vernon Presley, his father, called her into the kitchen one morning. He looked older, smaller somehow, his eyes swollen from sleepless nights. "You were with him that last night," he said quietly. She nodded. "Did he say anything?" Marion hesitated. Then she told him about the box. Not what was inside, just that Elvis had left her something. Vernon's lips trembled. He always said he'd leave behind one truth. He reached out a shaking hand. "May I see it?" Marion led him to the study, unlocked the box, and placed it gently before him. He opened the lid, stared inside for a long moment, then picked up the folded paper. His fingers ran over the ink like he was touching his son's voice. When he finished reading, tears streamed down his face. He whispered, "He wasn't afraid, was he?" "No," she said softly. "He wasn't." Vernon closed the letter and looked at her. "Promise me this stays between us." "I promise." He nodded once, placed the items back inside, and locked the box again. "When the time's right," he said, "people will need to hear it. But not now." For years, Marion kept that promise. She stayed in Memphis, quietly working at a small private clinic. She never gave interviews, never wrote a book. When people recognized her, she'd just smile and say, "He was kind." But whispers began spreading anyway. Someone in the press had learned of the letter, maybe from a staff member, maybe from a family friend. By the early 80s, stories began appearing in tabloids. Secret message from Elvis before death. Private tape could reveal final confession. Marion ignored them. She had made a vow. Yet one afternoon in 1981, she came home to find her front door slightly open. Inside, her drawers were pulled out, papers scattered across the floor. The black box was gone. Her knees gave way. She searched everywhere, hoping it had just been moved, but it was nowhere. Someone had taken it. For weeks, she heard nothing. Then one morning, a small package arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside the black box, unopened, a note lay on top, typed on plain paper. "Some things are meant to stay sacred." She never found out who returned it. When she opened the lid to make sure everything was still there, her hands shook. The letter was untouched, the tape still in place. But there was one new item she didn't recognize. A small gold cross on a chain. It must have been his. She held it tightly, tears welling up. "Thank you," she whispered. She didn't know who she was thanking. The thief, the stranger, or the man whose peace had become her burden. Years passed. The world moved on, but she never forgot that sound, his quiet humming on that final recording. She sometimes played it late at night, not to remember him, but to remind herself that he'd found what he'd been searching for all along. Peace. Not fame, not applause, just peace. She locked the box again and slid it into her dresser drawer. She thought that was the end of it. But fate wasn't done with the secret inside. Because one day, 20 years later, the world would finally hear the sound she'd been guarding all that time. The last song Elvis ever sang. 1997, 20 years after that stormy night. The world had changed, but Elvis Presley still lived in the heartbeat of every jukebox and radio dial. Fans still visited Graceland daily, some carrying old records, others whispering prayers at the gates. Marion Foster, now 68, lived quietly in a small house just a few miles from Beale Street. Her hair had turned silver, but her memory was sharp. She still kept the black box, its key on a chain around her neck. That summer, she received a call from a Memphis journalist named Tom Bradley. "Miss Foster," he said carefully, "I've been researching Elvis's final days. I think you know more than anyone." She almost hung up, but something in his voice, soft, respectful, made her pause. Tom continued, I don't want gossip. I want the truth. For the first time in 2 decades, she agreed to talk. They met at a quiet cafe near Graceland. She brought the box with her, wrapped in an old scarf. When she placed it on the table, Tom's hands trembled. This is real, he whispered. It's all that's left of the man, not the myth, she said. Back home that evening, she replayed the tape one last time just to be sure. The soft hiss, the faint hum of his gospel tune, the calm in his voice. It still broke her heart. Tom promised to handle it with care. Together, they arranged a small, private screening for the press at a local radio station. Only a dozen people were invited, reporters, historians, and 2 of Elvis's old bandmates. When the tape began, the room went silent. A faint piano note drifted through the speakers, followed by his voice. Weaker than most had ever heard it, but unmistakably his. Don't let them turn me into something I'm not. Tell them I found peace. Then he hummed the melody of How Great Thou Art, stopping midway to whisper, Thank you for loving me when I forgot how to love myself. The tape ended with static. No one moved. No one spoke. One of the reporters finally said, That doesn't sound like a man losing hope. It sounds like a man saying goodbye. Tom nodded. It changes everything, doesn't it? The story aired a week later on local Memphis radio before spreading worldwide. Headlines flashed across newspapers. Elvis's private nurse reveals final recording. The king's last words, I found peace. The world wept again. But this time for the man, not the legend. Outside Graceland, fans gathered in silence. They didn't sing. They just listened. Some brought radios, replaying the faint, crackling voice as candles flickered in the humid night. Marion stood behind the gates, unseen in the crowd. She heard his voice echo through the speakers, calm and clear even through the static. For the first time, she didn't cry. She smiled. He had always said he wanted to be remembered for his heart, not his crown. And now, finally, he was. Tom later told her that the radio station received over 1 million letters from listeners around the world. Most of them didn't talk about fame or nostalgia. They talked about forgiveness, about letting go, about finding peace. Marion kept one of those letters folded inside the box, beside his. It was from a fan in London who wrote, If Elvis could find peace after all that noise, maybe there's hope for the rest of us too. That's when she knew. The promise she made all those years ago had been kept. The truth hadn't destroyed his legacy. It had redeemed it. 2003 Memphis. The cicadas hummed outside as the morning sun spilled across the white columns of Graceland. A light breeze carried the smell of magnolia through the gates. It was peaceful, the way he'd wanted it. Inside the mansion, Marion Foster sat with the Graceland curator, a younger woman named Dana. Age had slowed Marion's steps, but her eyes were still clear. In her lap rested the same black box, worn now, the silver lock dulled from time. It's time, Marion said softly. He didn't want fame. He wanted truth. Dana nodded, gently taking the box. Inside were the same 3 things, the torn Bible page, the cassette labeled August 15th, and the handwritten letter that had traveled through decades of silence. Later that year, the Presley estate officially placed them in the Graceland archives, labeling them simply the Final Prayer Collection. Visitors could listen to a 1-minute restored clip of the recording, his voice low and tired, whispering, I just want peace. People came from around the world to hear that single line. Some left crying. Others stood in silence, holding hands. It wasn't just music anymore. It was confession. Marion passed away that winter. At her small funeral in Memphis, only a few close friends attended. On her casket lay one thing, the key to the black box, tied to a white rose. A few months later, a plaque appeared near the meditation garden behind Graceland. No one knew who had placed it there. It read, For the man who found peace when the music stopped. Every August since, during Elvis Week, thousands gather for a candlelight vigil. They walk through the mansion grounds, holding candles high as How Great Thou Art plays softly over the speakers. Somewhere between the gospel chords and the flicker of light, people say you can feel it, a calm presence, a kind of warmth. A sound engineer once swore that when he remastered the tape, there was something faint under the hiss, a second voice humming along with Elvis, barely audible. He didn't know what to make of it. He just smiled and said, maybe he wasn't singing alone after all. The legend of Elvis Presley will always be larger than life. But the man in that recording, whispering his prayer into the dark, showed something more powerful than fame. He showed grace. And that is why the tape matters. Because for once, the world didn't listen to him as an idol. They listened as if he were one of them. Fragile, searching, human. He didn't leave behind a performance. He left behind a prayer. Even now, when visitors stand in the quiet of Graceland, they say the walls seem to hum. Just a faint note, like the echo of a voice still asking for peace. Maybe it's imagination. Maybe it's faith. But one thing's certain, he found what he was looking for. And somehow he helped millions do the same. If the story moved you, share it with someone who still listens to Elvis, or someone searching for peace of their own. Because legends fade, but truth doesn't. And maybe, in the quiet between the songs, we can all still hear him whisper, I'm home.